Have you seen what is happening in South Africa? According to Trump, white South Africans are being persecuted. It is so bad that he signed an executive order offering white South African refugee status in the US. But are white South Africans really being persecuted in South Africa? Trump's order basically claims that South Africa is targeting white people, especially farmers, through violent attacks and land reform policies. His statement says, the Republic of South Africa is engaged in government-sponsored discrimination against its white population, particularly white farmers, through targeted attacks and unjust land seizures. Translation: Trump and his supporters believe that white South Africans are victims of government oppression and need US protection. Now, if you listen to this, you might think, wow, white South Africans are under attack. But that's not the whole story, not even close. To understand what's happening, we need to talk about how South Africa's economy was built. Because this situation didn't come out of nowhere. For centuries, South Africa was designed to benefit white people, while black South Africans were systematically shut out of land ownership, economic opportunities, and basic human rights. The 1913 and 1936 Land Acts made it illegal for black South Africans to own land in most of the country. They were pushed into 7% of the land despite making up a majority of the population. An entire system was built on racial segregation, where white people controlled the land, the jobs, and the wealth, while black South Africans were forced into poverty. Black South Africans were denied quality education and locked out of high-paying jobs, making sure the economic system only benefited white people. By the time apartheid officially ended in 1994, white South Africans, less than 10% of the population, still controlled 90% of the land and most of the economy. South Africa didn't just magically become equal after apartheid. The wealth, the land, and the power were still very much in the hands of the same small group of people. Since 1994, the South African government has been trying to fix this massive inequality. And let's be real, it is the right thing to do. You cannot have true equality when one group still holds all the wealth while the majority of the country struggles. Black Economic Empowerment is a program designed to encourage black ownership and participation in businesses. The land reform programs helps redistribute land that was historically taken from black South Africans. And the Expropriation Act allows the government to take land without compensation in certain cases to help address land inequality. Now, this land reform law is what groups like AfriForum are losing their minds over. They claim it's anti-white and proof of white genocide. But if you look at the bill, it states that property must not be expropriated arbitrarily for a goal other than public purpose or in the public interest. The Act further requires that the state must first try to reach an agreement with the owner to acquire the property on reasonable terms before considering expropriation, and land used in a productive manner must receive just and equitable compensation. Let's be real, South Africa is still one of the most unequal countries in the world. And that inequality exists because of apartheid and colonization. So, is fixing those injustices the same thing as persecuting white people? Or is it just an attempt to balance the scales? And this brings us to the narrative that certain Afrikaner political groups have been pushing, the white persecution narrative. Groups like AfriForum and some members of the Solidarity movement have been shouting from the rooftops that white Afrikaners, especially farmers, are under attack. They focus on things like farmer tax, suggesting that there is a targeted effort to wipe out white farmers. There is no evidence farmers are at any greater risk than anyone else. On average, there have been 69 farm murders per year, compared to the 27,000 murders per year in South Africa. That number includes black farmers, white farmers, and black farm workers. And according to Genocide Watch, white South Africans account for less than 2% of the murder victims, despite making up 8% of the population. Crime affects everyone, but the idea that whites are being persecuted is far-fetched. Then there's the government policies, framing them as anti-white instead of pro-equality. Black economic empowerment is aimed at increasing black ownership in businesses and giving black South Africans access to economic opportunities that were historically denied to them. It is a way of trying to close the growing inequality gap created by apartheid. Framing them as anti-white instead of pro-equality proves that when you are accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And then there is the international support, appealing to figures like Trump to step in and save white South Africans. It is interesting, though not surprising, that AfriForum is once again turning to Trump. just like they did back in 2019 when they went to the US to lobby against South Africa's land reform policies. But what's even more telling is that they didn't make the same appeal during Biden's term. If their case was legitimate and based on solid evidence of white persecution, why didn't they take it to the Biden administration? Why didn't they push for the same refugee status under a different president? The answer is pretty clear. Trump has always been receptive to their white victim racist agenda. AfriForum knows that Trump is sympathetic to the far-right rhetoric, and his administration has a history of embracing white victimhood narratives. That's why they're comfortable with him. They see in Trump a leader who won't challenge their version of reality, but will instead amplify to score political points. Crime is a huge problem in South Africa, but framing it as white genocide is misleading. The reality is black South Africans are far more likely to be victims of violent crime than white people. But that part of the story doesn't get told by these groups. And here's something interesting. Most white South Africans are not fleeing. Despite all the noise, most white South Africans, even those complaining about land reform, aren't actually taking Trump up on his offer. Why? Because they know that the narrative that they are painting is far from the reality on the ground. So what should we be asking? Instead of just accepting the persecution narrative, maybe we should be asking who benefits from the idea that white South Africans are victims. If we believe in the concept of justice, how can we allow that the injustice of the past continue without being corrected? And why do people care more about land reform than about the fact that millions of South Africans, mostly black, are still struggling to survive? It's not about punishing white people. It's about correcting a system that was designed to keep most South Africans poor. Let's be clear. The people pushing this white persecution narrative have an agenda. AfriForum, Solidarity Movement, and other right-wing Afrikaner groups need white people to feel like victims. Why? Because it helps them raise money. It keeps white South Africans politically united. And it gets international attention by getting people like Trump involved and gain global sympathy for their cause. But the truth is, they're not fighting for justice. They're fighting to protect the privileged status that Afrikaners held under apartheid. Let's be real, no one is persecuting white South Africans. They possess 90% of South Africa's wealth, 72% of South Africa's farmland, and they only have a 7.9 unemployment rate compared to the black unemployment rate of 30%. What's happening is that the government is trying and honestly struggling to fix a broken system, and the people who benefited from the system don't like it. So what do you think? Is South Africa finally addressing the past in the right way, or is there a better solution? Drop your thoughts in the comments.